There's so many people in my life who've had influence on my career and successes and sometimes failures. I've had formal mentors and informal mentors, and really what it came down to for me is it goes back to some of those earliest lessons that you learn in life. And if you think about where those lessons come from, if you're lucky, often they'll come from your parents. So it may be a little cute, but I'm going to talk about my mother and some of our conversations. So in our home, every evening before dinner, we used to gather, my mom, my stepdad, whoever used to be around, my siblings if they were around, or her students. She was a university professor. And before dinner, we'd get together and talk. We'd talk about deeply philosophical issues. We'd also sometimes talk about uproariously funny things where we'd be, tears would be pouring out of our eyes as we're laughing. And I should say at this point, I should just issue a disclaimer about everything that's going to come out of my mouth in the next couple of minutes. My mom was a Russian immigrant, a research scientist, a professor of medicine at UBC, all in a time when that was very unusual for a woman. So she was a force. And this source of wisdom would usually be delivered with a martini, extra dry, with an olive with a pit in one hand, and in the other hand, a very long Moore cigarette, those long, skinny brown cigarettes. And all of this would be delivered with a Russian accent. So that's the context, very important for you to hear that. So I'm going to talk about conversations, gems of wisdom that came out of those conversations, and I'm calling them, my mom's name, Nadine's 6 Keys to Success. So the first one is, and it's the title of my remarks tonight, is the world is your oyster. And I know that's an overused cliche, and I thought very hard about whether I should use an overused cliche with a bunch of business communicators. But as I thought about it, my mom was a really firm believer in this one. And very late in her life, she said to me, over a martini again, in one of those conversations, she said, "My only regrets are my sins of omission, not my sins of commission," which I think really speaks to the importance of just getting out there and taking the bull by the horns and getting everything you possibly can out of life. So it was those conversations that made me do some of the things that were a little bit radical for a kid. At 14 years old, I decided I wanted to get involved in politics, and so I went to Ottawa for my first leadership convention. That was quite an experience, being in all sorts of beer gardens and beer tents at 14 years old. It was a lot of fun. It got me to move to Montreal to learn to speak French at 17. I ran, as you heard earlier tonight, for elected office in Vancouver successfully for the first time at 25. And it's interesting, actually, I was saying to Sue earlier tonight, this particular building is really special to me because I was on the board when we opened it. And one of the very difficult conversations I had was with the senior manager on the park board who said this was going to be an arts-focused center, and they didn't think there was any place for locomotive 374, which is on the other side of this wall. And that was one of my biggest achievements, and it was, in my time on the park board, was fighting with staff to try and make sure that the original locomotive that came here stayed here. So, you think about all of those things, whether it's starting my own business or doing a redevelopment project or my passion for sailing. One of the rules that governs my life is I see no limits in my career or professional life, and I regularly, systematically ensure that I'm not going to have any regrets of omission. The second lesson was spend money on doing things, not buying things. As you can appreciate, my mom was for the first part of my growing up a single mom. My parents divorced very early, and so we didn't have a lot of money to spend on things. And so I never got gadgets, but I got lots of attention, and we went hiking and skiing, and she'd pull me out of school to do these things, and had lots of experience. And to this day, I still live my life that way. That's what I focus most of my energy on, is spending on doing things rather than buying things. I see money as an enabler rather than a thing of which to consume. There's a lot to be said for just showing up, she would say. And this is another, often said thing, but you really have to recognize you don't want to be a rock star at everything, or you would like to be, but you can't be a rock star at everything. So many days when I head off to a challenge, I say to myself, all I have to do today is show up. And strangely, a lot of those days when you're really terrified to go do something, that tends to be the most rewarding day or the most rewarding experience. Related to that, stick-to-itiveness is the key to success. You are seldom good at anything on the first try. Studies repeatedly show that the #1 characteristic of successful people isn't good looks or talent or even hard work. It's persistence. So, with everything that you do, stay focused on doing it and be persistent. And the fifth thing, which I think is, particularly in this group, I think is a really, for me, as a former 100% communicator, is something that I really took to heart. And that is that a PhD just means you know a whole lot about one little tiny thing and possibly absolutely nothing about everything else in life. And to me, that's one of the reasons I've really tried to focus on diversifying my experience and getting out there and trying to do other things. Mom sat on the medical admissions board for UBC, and she used to tell me stories over these martini sessions about the students who would be applying into the program. And it was very competitive at UBC to get into medical school, as you can imagine. And she'd have these straight-A students with absolutely perfect marks who would be in tears because they didn't get into medical school. And it's because when they were looking at their applications, they recognized that's all they were really doing. They weren't engaging in the rest of what life has to offer. They weren't playing sports. They weren't involved in volunteer activities. They weren't doing everything else. And it was those people who focused on being well-rounded and reaching out and looking at some of those other aspects of life that were truly the ones that would succeed. And to me, that's been a very powerful lesson. So, my background is in communications. I spent a lot of time and energy trying to diversify my experience. Right now, I'm trying to wrap my head around a finance program, which is a real mind shift for me. But I think that's, if you're looking to advance, one of the things I've found as a communicator is there seemed to be a limit to how far you could go as a communicator in an organization. But by diversifying that experience and showing the leadership team that you can do other things, you remove that ceiling. And I know for me personally, that's been a huge success, particularly at the port in recent years. And so if there's one thing I'd say is don't over-specialize. Make sure that you're well-rounded. And finally, probably the most important takeaway from these conversations with my mom is that ice-cold vodka pairs very well with fresh oysters. Thank you.